I'm so excited to be here. You can imagine, given the environment of academia, what sort of reception I typically get when I express myself. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll keep my comments short. Hopefully we can have a robust discussion after each of the speakers speak. The phrase identity politics gained momentum during the 60s and was often used as a term of derision, referring to parochial interests motivated by the social background or orientation of a particular demographic group. Race, gender, religion, and sexual orientation became powerful vehicles through which the personal became the political. One only needs to think about the African American civil rights movement and the gay rights movement to understand what's distinctive about identity politics. Both movements sought equal protection before the law for their respective communities and for their individual members to be treated with dignity and respect. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail is a powerful indictment against segregation precisely because it appeals to the same founding American documents and Western philosophical texts that some Southerners used to support segregation. So St. Thomas Aquinas and, yes, John Locke. Early gay rights activists, too, appealed to founding documents like the Declaration of Independence to argue for individual rights. While it is true that identity politics informed the demands of these two communities, it is also true that both movements at the time appealed to a more comprehensive and inclusive national identity. Such an identity helped each movement gain much needed support from a broad swath of America. Unfortunately, today, a vocal minority within both of these communities have embraced and advocate for an especially pernicious type of identity politics based on race and sexual orientation. Instead of speaking about the need for broader identities that are more integrative than self-regarding identities based on race, gender, or sexual orientation, speaking about a more compelling American narrative would be more effective at promoting integration and rootedness. New immigrants to America, for example, need a narrative that supersedes the old narratives and identities that once defined them in their respective countries. The more positive American narrative would tell a story about the role faith, family, and tradition have and continue to play in the evolution of the country, both politically and culturally. African Americans, too, would benefit from such a narrative. No longer is it enough to appeal to a creedal identity in the way Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement did. As one of the oldest minority groups in America, questions about identity have always been a central feature of African American culture. Unfortunately, given the history of African Americans, expressions of Black identity have often been at odds with the formation of a positive American narrative. For example, for nearly 5 decades, affirmative action has encouraged racial balkanization on the part of Blacks and whites. Now that affirmative action is no longer justified on the grounds that African American slavery was unique in American history and thus should be acknowledged and atoned for through specific policies that benefit African Americans, issues of identity have only grown more fraught. Affirmative action is now justified on diversity grounds, which means all people of color are incentivized to balkanize along racial lines to gain preferential treatment in school admissions and employment. In the context of the United States in the 21st century, simply appealing to creedal arguments to address the atavism and vitalism of identity politics is too weak. Contrary to some on the right, identity politics is not simply ideological identities in racial, cultural, or sexual disguise. It is a response to the same market and cultural forces that have fragmented other ascriptive communities: family, faith communities, ethnic communities. The overriding question of those who embrace identity politics, ironically, seems to be, who am I? This question is not simply one's personal reflection, but rather it evolves into a demand that one's assumed identity be recognized and should have juridical standing. College campuses are filled with this type of corrosive identity politics. According to the creedalist argument, Abraham Lincoln's New Birth of Freedom was a call to Americans to ground their collective identity in substantive ideas such as constitutionalism, rule of law, and human equality, all of which by themselves amount to abstract legalism. However, Lincoln's first inaugural address also speaks about the mystic chords of memory. Thus, the formation of the American identity does not begin with ideas. It begins in a particular geographic location, among a particular culture, and among a particular people. David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed convincingly shows that the American identity was formed from a core English-speaking settlers, a group of core English-speaking settlers that settled across the eastern United States in 1629 to 1775. These settlers and their British folkways account for the various regional cultures that endure today. Americans no longer have a common ancestry, but we certainly have a common culture that goes beyond mere ideas. America consists of a core culture animated by ideas. It has a civic, national, and cultural identity. The overriding feature of the core American culture is the Anglo-Protestant disposition. Individualism, not excessive individualism, moral reform, religiosity, and a robust work ethic. Whereas conservatives emphasize a shared history and inherited rights and responsibilities in the formation of the nation state, liberals emphasize voluntarism, the principle that an individual's actions and relationships are freely chosen. Voluntarism leads to seeing one's identity too as chosen and not necessarily related to that of one's fellow citizens, which leads one to identify more with members of one's class rather than feeling solidarity with fellow Americans. Such voluntarism enables the wealthy and well-connected to form networks among coastal, intellectual, or transnational elites, often at the expense of their compatriots. Because conservatives correctly prefer a shared history and inherited rights and responsibilities, and liberals prefer voluntarism, conservatives must make the case that the American identity isn't simply the sum of lofty propositions. Rather, again, it's the product of a particular geographic location, among a particular culture, and among a particular people. Therefore, the role of language, religion, and culture should become the focus of public policy, designed to foster a citizenry that embraces a common past and a common future. Is this big government conservatism? I don't know. But I think in order for this conference to be effective and what we believe to be enacted, it has to be fused with the levers of power. What does that look like? I'm not sure. Although Title IX, we've made progress there. So levers of power do become important in terms of how we exercise the values that we're advocating. Likewise, citizens have a psychological need for membership in a particular place. Particular places imbue their citizens with thick as opposed to thin identities. Thin identities have a weak cultural reference point. They are not grounded in any sort of particularity. Individuals with such identities aspire to be citizens of the world, but instead become citizens of nowhere. Thick identities are formed from the relationships, culture, and norms that each citizen internalizes simply by being an American. The initial formation of thick identities begins at the local level of a family, neighborhoods, community, and it is in these intimate gatherings that our epistemological need for systems of interpretation allow us to understand the world and choose a way of life, as well as a creative need for means of interpretation and expression. It is not only particularity that defines identities. The formation of identity also requires a broad narrative that integrates the particular, home, neighborhood, and community, into a country's national narrative. The simplicity and effectiveness of narrative confers a sense of naturalness on the state and its cultural particularities. National narratives can be construed broadly or narrowly. Alongside broad narratives such as George Washington and the Cherry Tree or All Men Are Created Equal, narrow narratives are communicated by institutions at the local level through school, museums, movies, and books, which function to disseminate the national story. National narratives need not be accurate in a strict sense, and they need not be noble lies. To be powerful, national narratives need most of all to appeal to the emotion and the human need to belong to something more than oneself. Just as significant, effective national narratives prevent the growth of antagonistic identities within the nation state, whereas weak national narratives encourage their growth. Liberal democracies remain strong to the degree that they know which identities not to recognize. Thank you.